Well, welcome. Thank you for joining Spear hosted webinar. Today, our webinar is on how does energy efficiency lead to better air quality? A little bit about Spear. We are a nonprofit. We're one of 6 energy efficiency organizations across the nation. We cover Texas and Oklahoma. Our work is over really kind of encompasses policy, building codes, high performance buildings, as well as local government. And local government is the program that I manage. And again, I don't know if I mentioned, but my name's Sean Auckland. I'm the local government program manager for Sphere. Our membership, and we are a membership organization, and our members also could include advocacy organizations, cities. And when we say cities, it also really is the local government umbrella of counties, state agencies, school districts, universities, really higher education, because also includes college districts for community colleges. And ESCOs, and then energy services companies. Manufacturers, we have a great kind of work cohort of manufacturers discussing heat pumps right now. And then as well as trade associations and utilities. And utilities, that is a pretty broad spectrum from munis to co-ops and then, to overall utility companies. And then I do want to add regarding most of our regional energy efficiency organizations, that includes a lot of us are funded through federal funds, through like the Department of Energy, as well as state agencies. And for Spear, it's, State Energy Conservation Office, as well as Department of Energy. And then my program that also is really a part of what this webinar series is the City Efficiency Leadership Council. Cities in the name, but it includes counties, local governments, as well as school districts and universities, and encompasses all that. And our purpose is to align regional partner initiatives. We also push forward research. We have roundtables and workshops, a lot of education and training. As well as I wanted to talk about some housekeeping. You'll receive the slides and an email, and then also receive the recording within 24 hours, but all of our recordings are on our YouTube channel. And then please respond with how we did in the survey. We do provide continuing education through ICC. So if you want to receive those hours, you do have to respond to the survey. And then also any questions you have, please have them at the end of, you can put the questions into the chat or question and answer, and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. Without further ado, I really appreciate Anton Hawks. He's the Air Quality Program Manager with the Capital Area Council of Governments. I'm going to go ahead and, Anton, if you want to share your slides and introduce yourself and give us more information about your background.
Yes, thank you, Sean. And fun little fact is Sean and I actually worked together. My, first job ever in Austin. When I was a grad student at Texas State, I actually interned for a summer with Travis County. And so we actually have some history going back. I won't say how many years, but it was a few, it was a few ago. And so it's great to be working with you again, Sean, and thanks for asking me to present to the group. All right, so my presentation is going to talk about the nexus between air quality and energy efficiency, but more I'm going to focus on is the air quality side of things and talk about how that connects with energy efficiency and why that connection is important for the public as well as for cities and counties. So I am the Air Quality Program Manager at CAPCOG, the Capital Area Council of Governments. which is a planning organization that works between the city or county level and the state level. And so we work on a regional level with local governments and stakeholders from the private and nonprofit industries to help us collaborate on issues that are bigger than one city or one county, but maybe not to the scale of having a whole statewide group work on it together. And so those are things like emergency communication, law enforcement training, as well as my program, which is the air quality program. So this is a snapshot of the Capital Area Council of Governments. And like I said, there's these COGs, Council of Governments across the entire state. You can see where your organization or where your COG lies based on this map. And I know that there are a few folks from Oklahoma as part of SPEAR. They also have this COG breakdown as well. So specifics about my air quality program, we work with local governments to implement voluntary actions to help us manage air quality in the region. And that is through the Clean Air Coalition, full titles Clean Air Coalition of Central Texas. In addition, we do outreach and education activities, and then a bunch of different kind of reports, like an annual report, emission control strategies reporting, as well as monitoring of air pollution so that we're able to track trends and see how our region's air quality is across the entire county, 5-county area. So with that, I'll go ahead and ask a poll question. All right, and so this leads me to my first poll question. On a scale of 1 to 5, how familiar are you with air quality issues in your area? With 1 being not very familiar and 5 being very familiar. And this will help me better understand how everyone on the call, or how much of an understanding everyone on the call has about air quality. And that will help me kind of scale the conversation up or down as needed. So Sean, whenever you're ready to close the poll, I'll read out the results to folks. All right. Okay, that's great. Yeah, so it seems like we have a good number of people on the call that are somewhere in the middle on air quality, where it seems like y'all know of air quality, but there might not be an expert level, which very few of us have that depth of knowledge on air quality. All right, so a little overview of what we'll be going over today. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS for short, which is the federal rules that apply to air quality. What is ozone and particulate matter, and why are they of special concern across the state? How is air quality in the state, and where does the air pollution come from in general? And then what's the connection between air quality and energy efficiency? Oops, there we go. So air quality in energy. So I think most of us know that all forms of electricity generation can have an environmental impact on our air, water, and land. But the choice of electrical generation can vary this impacts on air quality. And about 40% of the total energy consumption in the US is used to generate the electricity that we use. So jumping into the Clean Air Act, Clean Air Act was established in 1970, and it was amended in the 90s. And it sets standards for criteria pollutants, and there's 6 of them: carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen dioxide, ground level ozone, particulate matter, and sulfur dioxide. And each of these have a different standard of what concentration is acceptable. And those are based on the latest science on healthcare, toxicology studies, to determine at what point do humans start seeing an adverse effect of these different air pollutants. And so for each of them, they have different standards that the US cities have to meet. And if they fail to meet those, then area gets designated a non-attainment area. So not only is there a primary standard that's based on public health, but there's also a secondary standard that's based on public welfare. So For instance, maybe a pollutant like smog, ozone, humans will start being affected by it at a high level over a 1 day period, whereas plant life or buildings will be affected by it at a moderate rate over a 4 month period. And so they set separate standards over different averaging times and different concentrations based on what is that threshold that protects human health and what is that threshold that protects public welfare. And then the EPA is required, the Environmental Protection Agency is required to periodically review these standards to keep up with the latest science and make sure that the standards are still protecting public health as we learn more about these pollutants and how they affect our lives. So just going over, it seems like most of y'all have a beginning understanding or a moderate understanding of air quality. So I won't go into too much detail unless someone asks me to on what is ozone. But just as a reminder, when we talk about ozone in air quality conversations, we're talking about ground level ozone as opposed to the ozone layer. And so we like to say that ozone is good up high, bad nearby, which is to mean that the ozone layer, we like that it protects us from UV rays, but we don't want to breathe it at the surface level. And interesting about ozone is not directly emitted from a factory or from a car or from energy creation. It's actually a photochemical reaction where pollutants from your tailpipe or from other activities mix with sunlight and it creates ozone. So ozone isn't a direct pollutant. It actually requires some weather conditions to actually reach higher concentrations. And those are typically going to be very sunny days with high UV rates, with low winds, which, a state like Texas and even Oklahoma has that in abundance. And some of the health effects of ground level ozone. So short term, there's issues like shortness of breath, especially if you're someone in a sensitive group, like you have a pre-existing respiratory condition like asthma. It can also cause coughing and wheezing. And then long term, it can actually lead to more infections and hospital visits, especially those are in a sensitive group like a pre-existing condition, respiratory condition, or you're an older adult, and especially people under 18 can really feel the effects much faster than someone, an adult in the prime of their health. And then looking at particulate matter, or PM for short, this is a category of air pollution that is based on the size of the particle. And so anything can be PM if it's small enough. And so when we're talking about the size of PM, we're generally categorizing it as coarse PM or PM10 or fine PM, which is PM 2.5. And so you can see on this image, there's a comparison between the PM molecule size in a follicle of hair and a grain of sand. And so we're talking microscopic levels of PM. So we're not talking about, a large piece of pollen. We're talking about the tiny microscopic specks of dust that are not visible to the human eye unless it's there in abundance. And it comes from a number of different sources, from vehicle emissions like brake dust, construction projects, industry, so on and so forth. And like ozone, it has many of the same health effects, but it also has a few more because the size of the PM can actually enter into people's bloodstreams and cause cardiovascular issues as well as respiratory issues. So my second poll question is asking, is the area you live in meeting EPA air quality standards? And so if Sean, you can pull up that poll question, see how much people know about the air quality in their areas. I don't see the poll question just yet.
Technical difficulties.
Okay,
Let me see
yeah.
if I can get that going for you.
No worries, no worries.
Okay. Here we go. All right, I just launched it for you.
Perfect. All right. So yeah, I mentioned earlier that there's the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and the EPA decides or the EPA will look at every area in the country and designate if they are meeting those standards or if they're not. And so I want to know how many people know what the air quality is like in their area. Do you know if it's meeting or not? And don't worry, I'm not going to grade y'all or ridicule anybody for not knowing. Just want to know how much the audience knows about the area that they live in. So Sean, whenever you're ready, feel free to close the poll. All right. Oh, wow. A pretty even distribution of people knowing the standard or just not knowing. So that's pretty interesting. And it's great to see that we have, about 36% of people living in an area that's meeting the standards, or that believe they live in an area that meets the standards. All right. So going back to the slide deck. All right, so looking at ozone, here are the areas in the state that have air quality planning at a local level. Obviously, the state has statewide planning, but locally, here are the areas that have air quality planning. And you can see each area that is surrounded by a border, a bold border, like say the DFW area, the Austin area, the San Antonio area. They have air quality planning committees. If you look at the color, those that are in tan are going to be areas that are out of attainment of the ozone standard. And so you can see that the Dallas-Fort Worth, the Houston, Galveston, and the San Antonio areas are out of compliance. And actually the El Paso area, El Paso County is actually just tipped over into non-attainment as well. So they're actually going to be tan here pretty soon. And then you can see the areas in pink. Those are areas that have not met the 2008 ozone standard, but they are meeting the 2015 ozone standard. And so I won't bore y'all with the complicated legalese of how that works and how an area can meet the 2015 standard and not the 2008 standard. But it just means that area is still trying to meet the standards set by the EPA in 2008. And then looking at PM, I was going to show you guys the current non-attainment areas for particulate matter 2.5. However, the EPA is currently looking at lowering that standard. And so I thought it'd be good for me to show you guys a map of where they believe, the counties across the country will lie based on that new proposal. So on the, I guess, left-hand side of the table, it's showing you areas that would not meet the EPA's proposed standard for PM 2.5. And so you can see that there's a couple counties in the DFW area, one in the Port Arthur, Belmont Port Arthur area, one in the Travis County and Austin area, and a couple in the valley around Laredo and Brownsville, even further south. And then there's a few also in Oklahoma that wouldn't meet the standard. If you go to the table on the right-hand side, they did some modeling to determine what counties will not be meeting that standard in 10 years. So the EPA has to do some kind of cost analysis and determine how much of the country is able to meet the standards that they set forward. And this is showing that most of the state will be able to meet the standard, with the exception of a few counties like Travis County. El Paso County would actually worsen to not meet the standard. All of Oklahoma would be able to meet it. And a few counties down in the valley of Texas, in Brownsville, McAllen area. And this is just based on their projections and their modeling. This isn't locked in that these areas are going to be non-attainment or these areas are going to meet the standard in 10 years. They're just making a prediction on what areas, what air quality in these areas could look like over the next 10 years. And then just wanted to go over some of the trends that are happening across the country. I know talking to people here in the Austin area, people always assume that air quality is getting worse here. And that has a lot of that has to do with the amount of population growth, the amount of construction happening in the region, the number of manufacturing opportunities that are happening in the region. But contrary to that assumption, air quality in the Austin region is on a slowly ticking downwards. And so as you can see in the gray bars, that is the population growth over the last 30 years, I guess. And then on the black horizontal bars, those are the standards that the EPA is setting. And so the most current one is the lowest bar, the solid black bar, which is the 2015 ozone standard. And then the red bar is the concentrations that are being measured here in the Austin region. And so if you take a look at that, you can see that the Austin region is just below that standard, even with the population growing across the region. Similarly, in the Belmont-Port Arthur area, they're just below the standard, even with their population kind of staying static. Looking at the Dallas-Fort Worth area, they're above the standard, though they do still have the downward trend, maybe a little bit of a leveling off these past few years. And then El Paso, who I mentioned, is actually gone into non-attainment. They've seen a uptick in their ozone concentrations over the past few years. And hopefully there's going to be a downward trend that happens, and maybe it was just an isolated event in the region. But that is the trend over the past few years, is that there has been a kind of tick up rather than a decline like some of the other regions in the state. And so just quickly going over some of these other ones, I'm sure Sean will distribute these slides to everybody so you can kind of take a deeper look at all of this if you're so interested. But you're seeing a downward trend in both the Houston and the San Antonio area, though both are above the standards. So taking a look across the state at where these emissions are coming from. There are 4 major categories of where air pollution comes from. The first is going to be on-road mobile sources. So that's going to be anything that drives on the state highway. Any kind of car, truck, bus, refuse truck, any kind of anything that's legally allowed to drive on the highway needs to be registered. Those are going to be your on-road emissions. And then conversely, we have your non-road emissions. And so that's going to be the opposite pretty much. Any kind of engine that operates off-road. So think of construction equipment. Maybe it's like a crane that's helping build a tall building, or it's a dirt mover or something like that that just works offsite, or a generator. Any kind of engine that's a source of air pollution but is not used on the roads. And then you have point sources. Point sources are going to be industry and manufacturing. So that's where your power plants are going to go. That's where any kind of chemical manufacturing plant or refinery, all of those kind of large point sources go into that category. And then area sources is kind of the catch-all. It's the area where we put things like everyone's lawnmowers, maybe your personal generator in your backyard, or in your garage, or wherever you place it. It's the laundromats across the country. These all have emissions, but there's so many of them that we just use modeling to kind of catch all of them and say, there's about this many lawnmowers across the state of Texas. They emit about this much. And so it's based on a few more assumptions. Those numbers aren't as refined as the other categories, but it is a significant source of air pollution. And so you can see for the statewide, area sources are actually the largest category. But looking at some of the metro areas across the state, the breakdown favors, or maybe not favors, but leans towards on-road sources much more. So looking at DFW, the largest category is going to be the on-road mobile sources, and then the non-road sources as well are a significant factor. Then quickly looking at some of the other areas, El Paso area, about 50% of their emissions of NOx is from on-road sources. which is significant, and it's interesting comparing it to other metro areas across the state. Looking at the Houston area, they have a larger share of non-road, mobile, and point source. And a lot of that has to do with the industry that's in the Houston area, especially in the port. There's a lot of sources that do not operate on the road that generate quite a bit of pollution in the Houston area, or NOx emissions in the area. And then finally, just looking at the San Antonio and Austin regions, you can see the breakdown of their emissions as well. And so each metro area in the state kind of has a different breakdown of where air pollution is coming from. And so that's kind of why each region has a different planning organization, just because the strategy that works across the entire state may not work in Houston, which has much more of an industry led pollution breakdown, versus maybe the San Antonio area, or the El Paso area, which has a much more on-road generated source of air pollution. So the strategies to work in those different areas is significantly different. And then, though our organizations generally don't work on carbon emissions, just because they're not health-based, we do still track some of the carbon emissions across the country, and we're seeing more interest across the state to do a little bit more work on understanding the carbon emissions, which lead to climate change across the world. And so you can see here that in the state of Texas, industry is the leading source of GHGs, or carbon emissions, while transportation and electricity are also significant sources. That said, it may look like, commercial and residential energy use is only 4%, but then we have to recognize that a lot of the energy that's being produced at electrical plants is based on the demand from commercial and residential sectors. So though it's not direct emissions from a building, obviously there's not like a smokestack or a generator on most buildings, the energy is being created through the power sector based on the demand from the commercial and residential sectors. All right, and then I won't go over this whole thing, but if an area is designated non-attainment, there are a number of strategies that escalate over time to help a region get into non-attainment. Most of these are going to be based on a lot more planning that's required in the region. One of the major penalties that regions experience is, in order to get grant dollars for major projects, particularly transportation projects from the federal government, they'll need to prove that those projects do not lead to additional air pollution emissions, which can lead to a 10-year planning period that wouldn't have been there if the area was in non-attainment. And 10 years is typically a worst case, but it can get pretty onerous to prove that a project won't lead to more emissions in an area. But most of these have to do with planning, as well as more permitting for large sources of pollution. There are some things that do affect the public, things like having to have your vehicle inspection expected for emissions tests, as well as having to buy cleaner fuels, which generally cost a few dollars more, or a few cents more than an area that's in attainment and doesn't have to buy that higher quality fuel. So in addition, I found a few studies that different areas across the country, or across the state in Oklahoma, have implemented. The first was here at CAPCOG, we did a study back in 2016 that looked at what impact non-attainment would have on our region, and found that it would be around $24 to $41 billion worth of economic growth loss if the region went into non-attainment. And a lot of that had to do with some large facilities not choosing to expand in our area. And based on what we know now, that number is probably a little bit low. That 41 billion is maybe a bit low, because we've seen even increased growth of employers in our region that weren't even in that study. Things like Tesla and Apple and Samsung building new facilities here rather than what we knew back then was just an expansion of some of the existing source employers. San Antonio area did a similar study and found that between 7.1 billion and 36.2 billion economic loss. And then the Oklahoma City region also did a similar study and found 9.6 to $15.2 billion in economic loss over a 20 to 30 year period. And so, since then, the San Antonio area has gone into non-attainment. So it will be interesting to see how, if they're able to kind of check their accuracy on that projection of economic loss. All right, so jumping into some of the energy use slides. This slide here is showing where a lot of the energy or electricity is generated in the state of Texas. And so, Texas is one of the leading source of solar energy. And though that may be true, you can see on this map that, or on this chart, that our number one source of energy is natural gas, followed by liquidized hydrogen gas. And then renewables is a little bit lower on the chart. I think it's maybe 5th or 6th. And so, we're seeing growth in renewables, but I think it's important not to assume that all of the electricity that's being generated for buildings in across the state is being generated by a renewable source. And so a lot of this is coming from point sources that are significant sources of air pollution across our state. And that's even more important or not even more important, but more impactful in areas that are not meeting federal air quality standards, like the DFW area in the Houston area. So there are many things that we can do to help protect air quality through energy use. One of the biggest things is just knowing your energy use through your building. And here in Texas, there's actually a state law or statute that requires that public agencies and institutes of higher education report their energy use. And they're supposed to do that annually. And I know that Sean, if you didn't know about this already, Sean works hard to help the state and or help agencies across the state in Oklahoma make sure that they're tracking their energy use. And so that's through CECO. In addition, something that everyone can do, and I imagine Sean and the team at Spear can help y'all through this, is just making sure that buildings are staying compliant and that code is looking for opportunities to enhance or increase efficiency across your city or across your region, which really impacts how much air emissions are, how much energy is required to power your building, which conversely helps us reduce the energy demands at buildings across the state. And then getting towards the end here, reducing energy consumption can reduce air quality, can reduce air emissions because they reduce peak demand at power plants across the state. And even things like reducing your water use and reducing waste can have impacts on air quality. And I think that sometimes surprises people, but water use and waste, water doesn't get to us without any energy use. So, the water takes significant energy to be cleaned. It takes significant energy to be transported, heated and cooled. So looking for efficiencies there, even though that's not like a direct one-to-one impact on air quality, it does make a difference. Similarly, waste has an impact. Reducing the amount of waste that a building or a city or county is generating has significant impacts on waste, not just at the landfill and if there's an incinerator in your area, but also the amount of transportation, which is a significant source of emissions. It helps us reduce the amount of vehicles coming and going from an area to transport that waste. So just to provide y'all a little bit of a simplified, I know I kind of gave you a deep dive into air quality and how it works and how we track it across the state and how it impacts our federal rules. But I did want to give you guys more simplified, next steps on how you keep track of air quality over time. One of the biggest things is that across the country, the EPA has developed a program called Air Now. And Air Now helps us categorize air quality into the air quality index, or AQI. So this is kind of like a forecast that helps us break down what air quality looks like and what air quality will look like in the near future. So obviously something like green is good. And as you go lower, things like yellow and orange are a little bit worse for public air. Actually, in the Austin region today, it's predicted that we're going to be in the orange range for ozone pollution. And so we're having an ozone action day. We're encouraging folks to work from home or to drive less, to stay indoors if they're sensitive to air pollution. And so Air Now is where you can get a lot of that information without hoping that you see it come across your news weather report or your weather app and things like that. And so I encourage everyone to check out Air Now, and there should be air quality information across the entire state, and even other states and other countries like Mexico have air quality data in there as well. So with that, I have gone through all of the slides, and I'm happy to entertain any questions or discussion that anybody wants to have regarding any of the slides I presented today. So I'm just going to jump into the Q&A section real quick. Yeah, so someone asked or Kelly Campbell asked if I could explain the cost of non-attainment slide. So let me just go back to that real quick. So that is the impact of going into non-attainment. And so non-attainment is what you want to avoid. You want to say that your area, sorry, let me read the question real quick. Can you explain again the cost of non-attainment slide? Is that the cost to achieve attainment, or is that the impact of staying at non-attainment? So this is the impact of becoming non-attainment. And so the Austin area, the San Antonio area at the time, and the Oklahoma City area were all in attainment of the standards. So they were meeting the EPA's rules for air quality. San Antonio has since gone into non-attainment, so they're experiencing some of the impacts. But this was a study to see what would your region lose if you went into non-attainment. And so they're looking at economic indicators, things like how many large employers like manufacturers will come into your area. So I was here when Austin was doing ours. What we looked at is like, would there be an expansion of the Samsung semiconductor plant? And we got indications from them through interviews that no, if we went into non-attainment, they wouldn't still expand in this area. They would look to other areas in the country to expand their semiconductor plant. Just because the cost of doing permitting in the area would increase significantly. And so we looked at how much money would the region lose for not having that expansion because we're in non-attainment. And so I use Samsung as an example just because they were the biggest project that was on the docket at the time. But there's other smaller scale businesses that we also looked at and interviewed. In addition, we also looked at the cost of paying for higher level quality fuel, or for hiring more consultants to help us build out projects using federal funds. And so over 30 years, that can lead to a significant amount of economic money lost. And so, yeah, this is not the cost of going into attainment. This is the cost of becoming non-attainment. Hopefully that made sense. And I'm happy to share those studies with any of y'all if you're interested.
Yes, Anton, would you mind if you come across those studies, please, you can email them to me and I'll include them in the follow-up email.
Yeah, definitely. And so then I see in the chat, Ricardo, you've asked a question about Houston. Is it considered a non-attainment? So yes, Houston, I can go back to that slide real quick. Yeah, so Houston's one of the largest non-attainment areas in the state, just because of the size of Houston and the amount of population there. And so Houston is actually non-attainment for both the 2008 and the 2015 ozone standard. An interesting wrinkle about air quality standards is just because the standard gets updated to a lower level doesn't mean that your region resets. If you're not meeting the 2008 standard, even in 2023, you still need to go back and try to meet that standard currently. And so Houston and Dallas are both working towards meeting the 2008 and 2015 standards. And where that comes into play is, sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit, is that this chart here on the right-hand side shows the different strategies that they have to implement into their region. So, you know, you have 3 years in the marginal area, 3 years in moderate, 3 years to get to serious. And then you have a little bit of a jump here where you have 15 to 17 years. If you're in 15 to 17 years trying to meet those standards, it goes into severe. And then if it takes you even longer than 20 years, you go to extreme, where there's additional controls on an area. So yeah, the Houston area is one of the non-attainment areas that are severe for the 2008 standard, and then moderate for the 2015 standard. Let's see. All right, I'm not seeing any, let me go back, sorry, any additional questions. But if anybody else has anything, feel free to throw those in.
I did want to go back, the slide we're looking at right now, Anton, with non-attainment impacts. So if you're in a region that's non-attainment, does that fall upon all local governments that are within that region? And do you have to create this consortium of local governments to work together? So for Harris County, is it all the local governments that are incorporated in Harris County that has to move forward on it? And what do they call that? Is it the Clean Cities program? Or?
Yeah, so it technically falls on the state of Texas to make sure that the areas in the country or in the state meet the standards. And so they have to create a plan for those areas to meet. But obviously they work with local governments in the region to develop a plan that best represents the needs of the constituents there. So, it's an evolving conversation, and sometimes maybe the state will take a little bit more control or local government will take more control, but it's the state's responsibility. The EPA would sue the state of Texas, not the city of Houston or the Harris County or the Houston, Galveston metro area. But that said, that federal dollars do funnel into non-attainment areas, and they go directly to those organizations. So, our counterparts in the DFW area and in the Houston, Galveston area, and even San Antonio and other areas across the state have analogs to the Clean Air Coalition, where they'll have a committee of elected officials meet and make decisions on what they can do locally regarding air quality. And so I know that they have clean cities programs, they have energy efficiency programs, they have alternative fuel vehicle programs. Houston and Dallas have been in non-attainment for quite a while. So they have pretty robust programs and pretty extensive staff working on these kind of issues.
And then some other questions that I had is so the EPA would then reach out to TCEQ, the Texas Commission for Environmental Quality, and then they would then reach out to the local governments regarding that.
Yeah, that's kind of the breakdown, or that's how it's supposed to go.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's not a requirement that the state of Texas has to reach or work with local government, it just makes more sense. And I think it's part of Texas law to make sure that there's public outreach and public comment periods. But there are, so that's kind of the legal responsibility of how things break down. But then locally, the metro areas are allowed to apply for grants. And those grants are only available through non-attainment areas. A popular one is the congestion mitigation funding through the EPA in the Department of Transportation, where they can get funding. And the Austin area is not a non-attainment area, so we've never been eligible for this funding, but the area gets direct funding through federal means. And so there is a federal connection to those local areas, and there is expectations on those local areas to meet air quality, but it's not the same as the EPA requiring them to meet attainment. That's on the state to do.
Okay, thanks. And then we have another question in the chat. How do you know what plan your area, DFW in my case, is under?
Yeah, so I can definitely connect everybody with their local council. All areas across the state have the state of Texas and Oklahoma actually have a council of governments, and those typically are going to have your air quality planning organizations in them. So I know that the DFW area, theirs is through the North Central Texas Council of Governments, and we have counterparts across the state that I can connect everyone with who handles the air quality plans. But yeah, I would you can jump onto the North Central Texas Council to find the air quality pages and air quality plans for the DFW region. Right, let's see. And then just in case there's some additional information in the chat regarding the survey for the webinar, as well as a link to archived webinars as well.
Thank you, Anton.
Yeah, sorry.
And then, I appreciate that. And then also future webinars. We have one coming up just in a few weeks. In May is the Energy Equity Inspector that TEPRI had partnered with another regional energy efficiency organization, with SEIA. And it really has a strong focus on the federal government's Justice 40. So if you're interested in exploring that, I would really say take advantage of this presentation, because if you're applying for any grants or going through the IIJA, then it's a really great resource to support your grant application. As well as this coming May, we're going to be in person next week we're going to be in the Dallas region for a workshop and a happy hour. So please join SPEAR for that. And we'll also drop in the chat where you can go to find out our future events. As well as I wanted to showcase that we have a statewide survey going out. And if you want to be a part of that, it's eligible for, we would like all cities, counties, municipal utilities, and higher education and council of governments and community-based nonprofits to participate. The information that is provided through the survey will then be presented through a webinar in August, as well as at our SPEAR Industry and Policy Workshop in September. And then we'll also wrap it up with a report that'll go to the State Energy Conservation Office. And this will help them direct and finalize some programming that they'll be working on for the coming year, and also with the distributing of funds that they will be receiving through the federal government. The several bills that have been recently passed. And then how to stay connected. You can be connected to SPEAR and find out about our future events through our website, eepartnership.org. We also have a Facebook page. We're on Twitter, as well as we have a YouTube channel. Again, I mentioned that before, but we have over 100 videos that cover Information such as this one with air quality to energy efficiency with IT, and a substantial amount, over about 70 videos focus on codes. And as Anton mentioned, having your residential and your commercial buildings with the most recent code that Texas follows is pretty important for air quality and energy efficiency. I learned a lot today. Anton, thank you so much for your time and your expertise on air quality. And is there anything that you wanted to wrap up with? I love kind of, I don't know if any of you ever, this is a really a plug for the Energy Gang, but I listen to it quite often, that podcast. And so, Anton, do you have kind of a free kilowatt per se that you would like to share that's that you think about, like when it comes to air quality and energy efficiency, that you've really kind of said, you know, that's been such a great resource for me? Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a specific resource. I think it's just, we have a saying that is be air aware, and recognize the connection that everything has to air. And so every choice that we make to, drive or not drive, or to, install energy efficient equipment, or to run a generator longer than needed, has impacts on air quality, even if it feels fairly small. And so I like to, whenever I'm talking to people in the public, kind of make sure that they have that connection in mind, that it's not just a cost issue. There's also the environmental impacts of things like running your water more than necessary, of having the AC on when there's no one in the building. And there's a lot of strategies that I'm sure y'all know quite a bit about, that have an impact on air quality. And especially in those areas where you're non-attainment or you're near non-attainment, it's important to recognize that and kind of work with your local planning agencies to try and minimize the impacts you're having and reduce your energy demands. It is, it's not just the cost benefit, which I think a lot of us acknowledge and recognize as the highest priority, but it's also the environmental impacts as well, for public health and for carbon emissions. So I always say, be air aware and try to make sure you're connecting the dots there. And if you ever have to put any kind of documentation in front of maybe your elected body or in front of your stakeholders, put a plug in there for air quality. And, I'm sure your planning organizations can help you connect those. But if not, feel free to reach out to me and I can help you find documentation that connects that energy use or that water use to air quality here in the state of Texas.
Well, there you go. You hear that. Thanks, Anton. So I guess in our daily lives to be air aware, especially today on Ozone Action Day in later part of May. Uh, Thanks again, all of you, for sharing your time and taking time to learn more. Uh, And I guess hopefully we'll see you at our next webinar.
All right. Thank you, Sean.
And Anton, do you mind just hanging on for a few moments at the end?
Oh, yeah. No